Okay, good morning. So what I wanted to open up with today is you mentioned yesterday we're going to do say your testament base, but yesterday in the end of the Mishnah, we said that when they were having problems with rain, and eventually they got rain, so they came into the shul and they said Hal Hagadol. Um, so I said that to me this is a clear situation where you could use this Gemara as a raya in the debate and the question about whether or not one says Hal on Yom Ha'atzmaut. I said I would mention a little bit about it today. Um, the way I see this sugya is essentially this. The Gemara tells us in the end of Sanhedrin, the Gemara says over there in Sanhedrin Salidala that Chizkiyahu HaMelech got punished for Chizkiyahu HaMelech got punished. He could have been Mashiach. You remember the whole thing about the Ashur, right? Ashur came and attacked them, and Chizkiyahu didn't even fight. Malach came and put a plague, and everyone died, and the Jews were saved. Right? That's why when you go see if you ever go to the British Museum, you'll see there the big tablets of Lachish, the big battle that they won against the Jews. They beat the northern kingdom, but they did not ever beat Yehuda. This is a famous medrash in the Eicha, Sichta Rabbah and Eicha and Siman Lamed. The medrash over there says that Chizkiyahu was different than David HaMelech. David HaMelech went and fought wars and he won, and he gave credit to Hashem. Chizkiyahu didn't fight any wars, and nevertheless he still won. He just literally went to sleep. He didn't even daven, didn't chase his enemies. It was of the various kings, David, Asa, Yeshua, and Chizkiyahu. David fought. Asa, chased Yeshua, Davin. Or maybe reversing the order, and then Chizkiyahu just slept. So the Archaim in Shalach, in Parak Yud Beis, I think Pasuk Yud Beis, says that Chizkiyahu is the ideal. We can quibble on it, but Chizkiyahu didn't say Shir after this unbelievable victory where he literally didn't fight. No one died. Right, remember when we were doing brachas, we did Yonam and Aleph on the bottom. There's the guess of the Bach when they had the whole thing with Rav Shekeh was coming along and being Mecharef Magadif, the Jewish people, that they can't win, and you can't win against Ashur. I mean, they won. And he didn't say Shira. He should have been Mashiach. Why? Because we done V'Arba Sheva, the Gemara says everyone knew how to learn. Everyone knew it was Tyrus. I mean, like, people were unbelievably learned. That's how much of a tshuva he had made everyone do after his own father. And nevertheless, didn't say Shira. The Gemara tells us, so I mean that the Taina, if you have a nace that happens to you, you don't say Shira, it's a Taina on you. The Gemara tells us in Psachim Kuf Yud that Nevi'im were metaking Hallel by the Geula. When there was a Geula, they were metaking a Hallel. And Rashi over there says that's going to Chanukah. That's an example of that. The Gemara says, Gemara tells us in Megillah, on Yudal, the Gemara asks, why is it that we don't say Hallel in Purim? We should. It's a Geula. It has all the indicia of an ace. Now remember, the Gemara in Yom Chavtas tells us that Lamatzach L'Yelsa Shachar Ma Shachar Sev Kol Ela Afes Sev Kol Anisim. So the Nisim of Chanukah and Purim were not Nisim Geluyim; they were Nisim Nistarim. That is, if you wanted to deny the Nes, if you wanted to say no, it was just Derech HaTava, you could. You didn't have to see a Nes. You could have said Mordechai and Esther. That was great politics and managing the court, the intrigue. You could have said that, and you would have been not wrong. You could have gotten away with that. In the same way that in relation to Hanukkah, you could have said, look, Mapasio, his sons, they knew how to good battle tactics. They knew how to fight. You wouldn't be wrong. Nevertheless, we're still mitaka halal by Hanukkah. So why weren't we mitaka halal by Purim? On that, the Gemara says either because Kriya Zu Hallelujah, or in other words, the laning of Megillah is essentially halal, or because we don't say halal on Nisan that happened in the Chutz La'aretz. Okay, so what do we have when we take all of this sort of basics and we take our Gemara here that tells us that when they were fasting for rain and then they eventually had rain, they said Hallel. It tells us that you say Hallel when you see a nace. It's not a nace that's a nigla nace that's against nature. When it rains, it's not against in nature. It rained. Today they have cloud seeding. Today they have all sorts of things. Now there's this the latest technologies of how to create rain are if you take solar fields and put tons of solar panels together, you can create your own weather system and your own rain. So, okay, this is all nature. It's not a miracle in the sense of going michutz legidrat teva. It's miraculous, but it's miraculous because teva itself is a miracle. And if you learn how to utilize it, it's fantastic. So what's my point here is that when you have a nation in Eretz Yisrael, where the Jewish people for the first time are in control of their land for the first time in 2,000 years, and not Pashim, a whole, even if it was a nation that the world decided to give them partition, and then a nation that all the armies attack and they're able to win. So it wasn't a Pasha. So isn't it like what's left to debate? Of course you have to say Hal, and of course you have to say Hal with the Barak. What's the question? The Meiri, I didn't mention, the Meiri writes there in Sanhedrin that a Yachid who has a nace happen to him, he says Hal, but he says Hal without a bracha. Right? The Mishnah Berurah writes the Mishnah Berurah writes in I think it's tough Reish Pevav. He writes that any Yachid can make a nace. Any community can make a Purim. There were, if you go look at the Pinkuses in different communities in Ashkenaz that we still have, they had special holidays, fast days, holidays that were for their communities. So what's the issue? What's even the question? Now, again, if you want to take the idea of the Satmar and then this is Sitra Achra, there's nothing to discuss. That's not what we're talking about. What's about? People say like, well, it says unbelievable names. So isn't it Pashut they should say Hal? The answer is no, it's not so Pashut still. And there's two factors why. One is because what day is the day that you say Hal? Do you say Hal on a nace, right? When did we say Hanukkah? When did Hanukkah take place? Hanukkah takes place on the day that the Jewish people come back in to the Beis Hamikdash and they're finding, lack of oil except for one Pach Shemen. That's when we do Hanukkah. It's the culmination of the victory over the Greeks. Now they're back in the Beis Hamikdash. When do we do Purim? Purim, in terms of Haman, getting killed and all of that stuff didn't take place in Adar, right? That stuff took place in Nisan. Why are we doing Adar? Because there was a Gezerah, and the way it worked in the Persian Empire, once the Gezerah was in place, it's like a runaway train. You can't stop it. It's on the tracks and there's no brakes. So there was a day. It was the Gezerah. You couldn't change the Gezerah. The Jews are going to get killed on X day. What happened? They changed it around. And now the Jews are able to go attack their enemies and go vanquish them. So the day of the 13th was the day of the Gezerah for the Jews to be killed. They win a big battle and destroy all the enemies. So we celebrate the 14th day. And they gave an extra day in Shushan. So okay, they have the 15th day. It's a day we understand how it's connected. It was the big day that they beat. What is the day of Yom Ha'atzmaut? It's the day when they announce that they're going to have a state. It's very nice. But where's the miracle in that? On that day, first of all, it was before the war. They had no idea if they were going to win. And second of all, the day of the announcement is, how is that miraculous in and of itself? So, as a halachic matter, you can acknowledge the state of Israel is a wonderful, then you can acknowledge it's a huge nace. But technically, should you say Al on that day with a bracha? Where's the miracle on that day? The second fundamental problem is that, like the Mishnah Berurah writes, when do you say Hallel? When the community behaskama, obviously you can always have one guy who's like, no. You always have one guy who's going to say, no, that's not this. But the general community thinks that this was a big nace, they should say. So in Eretz Yisrael, was there a haskama of the general, again, not the nose, but within the from normal community who thinks that the state of Israel is relatively a good thing? Not only racist, which is a lot of the Haredi world, but they all agree to say, hell no. So where do you get the haskama of the whole community to say it? In fact, in the modern day state of Israel, in 1948, the rabbis did not institute Hallel with a bracha. In 1948 till 1974, they never said Hallel with a bracha. Meaning, maybe some people did, but I'm saying the official rabbinate said you don't say Hallel with a bracha. Why? Because we're missing these two aspects. We're not clear. In 1974, Rabbi Shlomo Goren instituted Hallel with a bracha. Why? He said, look, we've had now a whole series of wars. 1948, there was wars of 56. There was the wars of 67. Then there was the attrition war between 67 and 72. And then there was the 73 war, Yom Kippur. And they won all of these. And they had now a huge chazar of Jews to the land of Israel. There were over 3 million Jews by that time, which is like 5 times more than the Jews that were there in 1948. They managed to survive and to thrive and to become at that point, then we should say Hallel Bracha. At this stage, now we see that this Yom Ha'atzmaut was not a declaration of just a random day. No, now we see that it was really a something. It's really a thing. And I'll conclude with one more thing, which is, at what stage would everyone agree? Haskamas kulam, again, without the Sitra Achra people, but just the normative from community. This is like legitimate. We should say Hallel, right? The Malchus Beis Chashmonai. I think I said this and I proved this on a Shabbos day months and months ago. What was it? Months? No, it was Yom Ha'atzmaut this year. Yeah, that if you look in the Rambam in the beginning of Chanukah, the Rambam says that how long was Malchus Beis Chashmonai? About 200 years. But if you go with the Gemara says that when the Romans came in, there's still Malchus Beis Chashmonai, but the Romans were invited in by the Chashmonai because they couldn't get along. They were fighting with each other, right? They invited in the Chashmonai, the Romans. And the Romans, once you invite them in, they're not leaving. And eventually it leads to the destruction of the Mikdash. So that period of time, once they already had the Romans batting down on them when they were already in town, that's still 100 years left to the Beis Hamikdash. So that's to say, the actual Chashmonaim, quote unquote, independence, whatever that was for about 100 years. The state of Israel is now almost 80 years. So at what point there's a flip and everyone says, you know what, this is no less than Hanukkah. In the sense that the amount of sovereignty, which again, we can, with the current events, discuss, is that real sovereignty or not? We're not getting into politics, but that's really the fundamental question, right? At what stage you say, you know what, this is really not, compared to what Hanukkah was, this is really not that different. Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel, that's an amazing thing. To have it for 80 years, 100 years, like, okay, at some point, everyone has to acknowledge this is really amazing. And then it should be said, Hallel with a bracha. At this stage today, there are still, obviously, most of the normal Haredi community does not say with a bracha. There are those, of course, that don't say Tachlan, even if they know there are people who say, the people who say deliberately Tachlan and all that, like I said, are not relevant for the conversation. All right, Zot the Gemara. We are at the 2 dots, right? We're on New Testament Aleph, the Gemara. Say the Tanya say Elo Amar B'Ravi Rishayna. It's helpful to remember before we do this, just to remind ourselves that we had a couple of Gemaras before. Remember the Gemara back on Vavam and Aleph. The Gemara Vavam and Aleph told us towards the bottom. The Gemara said that there was Ravi Rishayna, right? The first series of rains, right? What were the first series of rains? Bechira, the first one was B'shloshim Marchashvan, Beinanis B'shiva Bay, Afela B'shiva Asaba. It was according to Tanakama. So that means it was something called Ravi Rishayna, first rain, and that was expected to take place by the 3rd of Marchashvan, the 7th of Marchashvan, and the 17th of Marchashvan. Okay? And then we have to go to another Gemara on Yud Amud Aleph. The Gemara on Yud Amud Aleph told us in the Mishnah, second Mishnah on the page, it says, Higia Yud Zayim Marcheshvan, it's the 17th day of Marcheshvan fell out. In other words, we already had the 3rd and the 7th, and now the 17th. So we've gone through the Revir Rishon, we've gone through the first series of rains, expected rains. If they have now passed, so Eschilu HaYechidim Mis'an Gimel Taniyos. Then the Yechidim, the special people of the community, they start their fasting. It's not the whole community. And then if Rosh Chodesh Kislev came along and all Yardu Geshamim, then based on Gezer and Shalosh Taniyos, there's a whole series of 3 fasts, 3, 3, and 7 on the wider community. Okay, so now let's open our Gemara again. Says the Gemara, say the Tanya, say Elo Amar Rishayna. The Mishnah told us that this Seder of Taniyais, that the Yechidim are going to start fasting. That's talking about the Revir Rishayna, right? The first series of rain. So, Fred the Gemara, but I'll ask you a question. Vermini, I have a price that says not that way. Revir Rishayna, Shneil Lishol, Shlishos Lisanais. But I have a price that seems to suggest that by the first and second rains, you don't fast, but rather you are only asking for rain. But shlishis lisanis, by the third rains, that's when you start fasting. So what's the Gemara's question? The Gemara's question is, as Rashi notes, sha'afa pi shelo yardu geshamim leiber shana bleiber shnia leheimisan ala shaylin. The kasher masnisan. It's the question on Mishnah. The Taanit said it Taanit said lama revir shana u'braisa adadi. So now we're asking on our Mishnah, which sounds like after the first rains, you're doing all these fasts, or at least the Yechidim are doing these fasts. And over here from this price, it sounds like you're only doing the fast for the Yechidim after the third series of fasts, meaning after the third series of rains, right? The first three rains have to go by before you are going to start fasting, right? Which again, the pashut way to have read this is what? What does B'Revir Rishayna mean? Right? In other words, B'Revir Rishayna, we saw the Gemara told us back on Hayam and Aleph, Vavam and Aleph. What the Gemara said? The Gemara said, "Ezdeu Revir Rishayna." What is Revir Rishayna? B'chir b'shloishim hakashim menes b'shiva boy, afela b'shiva asar boy. Right? The first series of rains is seventh, third, seventh, and 17. So that's called Revir Rishayna. I have a question answer to the question, but that's not how the Gemara answers it. I think the Gemara could have said, that you only start fasting after the third. Again, but that's not Revir Rishayna. The definition of Revir Rishayna is the first series of three rains. But okay, the Gemara has a different answer. Says the Gemara, Amrav Huna, the slide says, Amrav Huna Hachikamar, Seder Taanit Amar, the Seder Taanit of our Mishnah. Amosai, when is that? Diman Sheyatz Revir Rishayna, Ushnia, Ushlishas. Once the first series of three rains goes by, V'lo Yardu Geshamim, Aval Yardu Gesham Revir Rishayna. But if rains fell at the first time for the rain, Vizaru, and they planted, V'lo Tzamchu, and it did not grow. Inami Tzamchu, or maybe it did grow, but v'chazru v'nishtanu, but it somehow it changed its appearance. It wasn't growing normally. So then, masrin alei miyad. Then they start doing the fasts right away. They're not waiting any time. So in other words, the pashut answer that I could have given, that the Revir Rishayna is talking about the first series of three rains, right, on 3rd, 7th, 17th, the Gemara doesn't go with. The Gemara instead says that what we're meaning is that Rav Huna is suggesting that the Seder Taniyos that we're talking about, of course, the Yechidim don't start fasting until after the first, second, and the third. But if the rains fell by the first, meaning after the third of Mar Cheshvan, and nothing grew, or maybe it grew, but it became super odd. It was growing in an abnormal fashion. So then Masrin Alemiyah, then we start fasting right away. We don't wait anymore. Rav Nachman, Dafka Nishtana. Rav Nachman adds on that Dafka talking about a situation where the growth was super weird. Aval Yavshu, but if the growth dried out, if the stalks dried out, then we're not going to say that you are fasting. So the Gemara says Pshita. What's the big chiddush of you, Rav Nachman? We said that if the rains fell and it either grew right, but it changed, or it didn't grow at all, that's when you masriyim miyad. But if you're talking about a situation where it dries out, then you're not fasting right away. So what are you telling me? We never discussed the case of Yavshu. We only discussed the case of Nishtanu or Loy Tzamchu. Says the Gemara, no. There's a reason Rav Nachman is telling you something interesting. What is he talking about? We have to put here the Bach. The Bach says that we're talking about a situation of the Hadar Akun, right? Meaning that it was dried out, and then it produced some stalks. So Mao the Tema Kantamilsi, you might have thought that maybe these new stalks or something, and it's relevant. Kamash Malon, it's not relevant. This new growth is not going to be relevant, and therefore we're going to keep on a regular Seder as we would have normally. So in other words, on Pashat reading of this Gemara of Seder Tanya said, we want to ask a question on our Mishnah. The Mishnah said that when do you start the Seder of Tanya? When do the Yechidim start fasting? That's Amar B'Ravi Rishana. That's after the Ravi Rishana doesn't happen. Meaning, the Pashat way to learn it was that if the rain didn't fall on the 3rd, 7th, and 17th, according to the Hanakama there, then the Yechidim start fasting. The Gemara asked it as a question. What do you mean? But don't we know that the Ravi Rishon Shnir is Shlishus Lisanis? Don't we know that you only start fasting the Yechidim after the 3rd rain? Yeah, you're right. It's after the 3rd rain doesn't fall. That's all called Ravi Rishona. So I still think, and I haven't seen anybody ask, that that's really the Pashut answer to the Gemara. It's not a question. The Brisa and the Mishnah are getting along. Each one is calling it Ravi. Each one is calling maybe something a little bit different, but it's the same Ravi Rishona. Ravi Rishona includes 3 rains, as we saw in the Gemara earlier on Vav, and here we're saying we're calling it Ravi Rishona Shlishis, but that's still part of the Ravi Rishona, and you're not supposed to be fasting the Yechidim until after the 3rd series of rain. So I think that's the simplest way to explain the stira. Nevertheless, the Gemara says Rav Huna's answer, and the Gemara Rav Huna's fundamental answer is that it's true that we don't start the fasting until all 3 times that it was supposed to rain didn't happen. But the chiddush is that if the rain fell and nothing happened by that first rain, you couldn't see any results out of it. V'loy tzamchu, or it was tzamchu, but it was nishtanu in some way. It grew very weird. Then masrim miyad. Then you start fasting right away, and that's how the answer of Rav Huna is. But what that answer then means is that Seder Taniyas Elu Amar B'Ravi Rishayna means that you're reading the Mishnah that the first series of fasts are going to start when it rained once and nothing grew. When it rained once and it grew weird. Meaning that Rav Huna is reading the Mishnah that B'Ravi Rishayna means that first series of the first rain of the first series, right? The Gimel Marcheshvan type of rain, which again doesn't seem to be the simplest reading of the Mishnah. So I'll leave that as a bit of a question. Nevertheless, we have to move on. So start the Gemara. Taisus here says the same as Rashi in the top Taisus of Let's Tzricha Akon. It's the same basic idea that we ignore the growth that happens after something dried out. It's not going to change our normal course. Fine. Zak the Mishnah. The Mishnah told us the next lines of the Mishnah that if if it rained, but then it stopped raining, and it was 40 days in between these rains. So in that situation, the Mishnah said Masriin alem miyad. You start crying out right away. Again, I'm not sure what it means. Start crying out right away. It's already 40 days have passed. So you had missed a whole bunch of rains. But the point that we're saying is that if it started raining, and presumably then that we don't view it as a drought year, so you would not have started your Seder of fasting, even if it didn't rain for a week or 2. It had to be mamash over a month, and then you would start. But then you wouldn't. Then Masrin Lamiyad, you start right away. Fine. So the Gemara wants to know, what did the next line of the Mishnah say? The next line of the Mishnah was that the reason that you start right away after 40 days of no rain, when there was a first rain, but then no rain for 40 days, because this is a famine. This is a type of a famine. Fine. Now, the Gemara asks, "My makas b'tzeres." What do you mean a famine? I'm Rav Yehuda Marav. Maka mevila b'dei b'tzeres. It's a kind of a plague that's going to lead to a drought. Meaning, not having rain for 40 days doesn't by definition mean it's drought, because it could have rained really nicely, and then it stops raining for 40 days. So it doesn't necessarily mean you're in a drought situation. It could be that things grew already well. It could be you have enough water in all the cisterns. It doesn't necessarily mean you're dying of thirst. But it could lead to that if you don't have constant replenishment. Rav Nachman Nahara. So we turn the page now to your Testament base. Rav Nachman adds that when it comes to river, here is very interesting. Rashi and Taisus, we know today as well, right? It's a lot easier to ship, right? If you ship by air, it's the most expensive, right? Shipping by sea is the cheapest. Rail is also very cheap, right? Rail and sea are the cheapest. What's the most expensive is the air. The next most expensive is by land. So if you look here in the Taisus of Nara, we're not going to have time to go through it, but Taisus mentioned this point as well, that shipping by the river is much easier than shipping over land. Um, yeah. So so for our purposes now, what does it mean Nara Nara? It means essentially a few pshatim are given, but the one we'll use is the one Rashi says, also Taisus says it, which is, let's say there's no you're lacking food in your town, but there's food in the next town, and there's a river that goes between the two towns. So you take the river and you'll have enough food. It's relatively easy. But if the only way to get the food is over land, meaning there's no river that connects, you have to take the food by horse and buggy, then that would be much more expensive. It'll be much less available. So it says the more Amrav Nachem Nahara. If there's a situation where there's a river to river transfer available, then Bitsorta, that's called a Batsaris. It's a sort of a drought, but it's not fatal. It's not terrible. So Medinsa Kafna. But if it's a mamish from city, from the country to country, meaning as Rashi says, there's no available river route, right? There's no available route by water. You have to go by land. You have to take stuff by horse, by donkey. So then that's considered to be a famine. And that's a famine is obviously a lot more significant. Taisus points out here, and this is what I wanted to focus on in this Taisus, on your Tesam the bottom part of Taisus. Taisus asks a question here, going back to your Tesam for a second. Taisus says, but I don't understand. If you look at our Mishnah says that if there's a situation when it didn't rain for 40 days, that you have to be Masrim and Miyad. Why? Because it's a terrible famine. That's the mashmalis on the Mishnah. And now we're saying, well, if there's a Nahara, if there's some sort of water route between the two towns, it's not such a big deal. It's not a kafla, it's not a famine, it's a drought. But you'll manage. So Tais asks, but I don't understand. The Mishnah is mashma that you're going to be misanin and masriya miyad, right? It's going to be a terrible thing because it's a makas mitzvah, it's a big drought. And now the Gemara is saying, well, actually, it's a betsorta. You have really bad famine. That's kafna. But Cyrus is not such a bad thing. There you manage to get food because you have it coming from a different town, but it's going to come by boat. It's easy. You'll manage. So answers Taisvez that the Mishnah, when the Mishnah says makas betzares havik k'may kafna, and that the Mishnah when it said that you have to start Masriya right away, that was talking about really about a famine. The lashon of the Mishnah betzares is really like kafna. The big chiddush in Taisus, right? Because the Gemara is very clear. But sorta and kafna, but sorta is a lot easier than kafna. Kafna is a real famine. A real rov is a kafna, not a batzeres. And the Mishnah is mashma that a batzeres is something that you are going to Masriya Masana right away. That it's really bad. But the Gemara is saying that's not really so bad. So Taisus, you have to say the Mishnah's batzeres really is like a kafna. It's really like a famine, not like just a drought. That is Taisus' chiddush to explain why the Mishnah sounds like batzeres is so terrible, and the Gemara is like, not such a bad thing. All right, Zot Gemara. All right. Rav Chanina, saw besela. If you go out and you'll be able to buy a saw flour for a sela, ushchicha, and it's available. In other words, there is what to buy. That's considered batsorta, right? That's considered to be a batzeres because it's more expensive than the typical price, right? As Rashi says, when they're selling you a saw of chitin for a sela, the hainu yaker u'mitzuya, it's expensive, but it's able to be purchased. The mitzuya liknas b'choles, but that's considered a batzeres. The this lashon of saw b'sela, if you look at Mabasha Tzadi Aleph, the Gemara over there talks about the excuses to leave Eretz Yisrael, right? So you have excuses to leave Eretz Yisrael, most of them are in Avodah Zarah Yud Gimel, right? When are you allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael, right? The Rambam in Hilchos Malachim Perek Hey, right? They left because it was the dinner. What normally costs a saw for a dinner costs 2 dinar. The lashon of the Gemara here is a little bit different, but the essential idea is the same, which is you really have no excuses to leave Eretz Yisrael, right? You're allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael only if you can learn better outside of Eretz Yisrael, or if you can marry somebody which you can't find in Eretz Yisrael, or if the food prices have gone too high. And even then, they got punished back on the Chilin for leaving Eretz Yisrael because of the famine that they had in their time. Fine. So says Rabbi Chanina, saw bestseller v'shchicha, if the cost of a saw of chitin is a stella, which is expensive, but ushchicha, it's around, you can find it in the stores, bitsorta. That's considered a batzaris. Arba, right? That we have to look here in the Bach. Arba saw in Misela, we have to add in those words. So if Arba saw in Misela, if it will be four saw of chitin for a sela, in other words, the prices haven't gone up; they're cheap. In theory, they're cheap, but v'lo shchicha, but there's no food to be had. In other words, they're selling you four saw for chitin for one sela, but you can't find it in the stores. There's nothing there. So then that is a kaftan. That's mamash a famine. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Lo Yishana Lo B'zman Shemayis B'zol, Peres B'Yakir. Rabbi Yochanan says, what is this talking about? That's when the money is being seen there as a commodity. When the money is cheap, so money is available, right? It's a runaway inflation, right? If you go to a place like Venezuela, right? I don't know about today with Delcy Rodriguez, but if you go back to Venezuela on the days of Hugo Chavez and the previous guy, I don't know the bus driver's name, who the guy was the head of it, in between Chavez and Delcy Rodriguez. It was a guy. What's the name? The guy was arrested. Anybody know? No. He was a bus driver. He was the president of Venezuela for many years. So during his day, they're printing money, printing. So that's Moyes result. There's money available, right? If you think about the United States, when there was the times of the colonies, right? They had paper money. So paper money is worthless, right? We today have paper money, but it's backed by well, I don't know what it's backed by. That's a big question. But you have paper money for a long time. There was a gold standard and a silver standard. What does it mean? It means that if you took your money to the Fort Knox, yeah, I would like some gold. They had gold to give you, right? Today we have money that's backed by nuclear weapons. So a different kind of an idea of how money is backed. It's the first experiment in the world. But sometimes money is cheap. Money is available. Says Rabbi Yochanan. When are we talking about? It has to be available money. If there's no fiat currency available, then this is not relevant. Right? They're only going to be relevant if you can have money to actually go purchase these things. Right? A Paris Bianca, the cost of the chitin is a sella, so it's quite expensive. Paris Bizol. But if it was money is expensive, nobody has any money to go buy anything. So then, then we're not waiting. We're going to start right away because that's even before you get into a famine or whatever. But if there's no money and the price is up, of course, that's for sure a situation of a famine that one has to cry out about. Rabbi Yochanan, Neharina, right? That means I remember, as Rashi says, Kad havikaimi dal som. He says, I remember a time when the cost of 4 son of chitin was 1 sela. Fishi nafchi kifen bitzveria mideles iser. And I saw souls that were nefichi kefen. They were like mamish swollen with hunger. That's what happens when people are dying of hunger. Why me the less isser? Because there was no money. There was no money to buy. You could have bought 4 sav chita for a seller. But if you haven't got any money, you can't do anything. In those days, silver money, whatever it was, they didn't have anything. So if they didn't have any money, they couldn't buy it. So they were swollen with hunger. Then you're masriya miyad. So the only time this whole thing of sabasela is going to be a situation of a batzeres where you take your time, as Pesach already pointed out. Batzeres here is not like masriya miyad. That's the Mishnah, which is really a kafna. But for our understanding of what batzeres is, you're going to wait some time, see what happens, see how it develops. Says Rabbi Yochanan, that's only the situation where the money is freely available. If the money is not available, if you can't find money, then you would be masriya miyad. So it comes out. This big chiddush here, and the only way really to understand this Gemara is that Batsaris in the Mishnah is like a kafna. If Batsaris in the Mishnah is Batsaris of the Gemara, then it doesn't make any sense because the Gemara here is making a distinction between Batsaris and kafna. Kafna is masrim miyad. Batsaris is you have some time. Let's think about it. Let's see how things develop. That wouldn't fit with the Mishnah without Tosfos. Okay. Zod Gemara at the 2 dots. Yordul Tzmochan Avleli, and we already mentioned this Gemara yesterday. We had it back on Gimel and Beis, the same idea. So what does it mean? What does it mean that it comes down nicely for the vegetation, but not for the trees? That's when the rain is, developing nice. It's coming down nicely, but not powerful. When it comes down for the trees and not for the vegetation, right? When it comes down nicely for the trees, but not for the vegetation, is when it comes down powerful, but not nice, not sweet, not like soft. But it's coming down for the trees and the vegetation, but not for the cisterns, not to replenish the water supply. How do you have them? It's coming down hard and soft, but it's not coming down a lot, so it's not enough to replenish the water. The water containment systems. Elohad, Tanya Zati Gemara, Yard Lubar, so Shiklam Mars have little Zev, little Zehek, and Mishkachas Lafret Gemara, unbelievable, right? How could it be that it's going to rain for the Bar Shiklam Mars? It's going to rain for all the water systems, but it's not going to rain for the trees or the vegetation. By definition, if it's filling up the water systems, it should be good for the trees and the vegetation. Everything more. The Asya Bishipi Chusa. It's coming down in a pour. In other words, think about the Gemara Rosh Hashanah Tezayin, right? If people were not good at the beginning of the year, so they got a bad judgment for the amount of rain, and then they became big Bali Shuv in the middle of the year. What does Hashem do? Hashem puts the rain tiny, tiny bit. They only deserve it, but He's going to put it in the right times in the right places, so they're going to have enough. And if they were big tzaddikim Rosh Hashanah, and they became big Bali there in the middle of the year, and Hashem promised them a lot of rain, what's He going to do? He's going to pour it all in one place, in the wrong place, in the wrong time, and a huge amount. That's what we're talking about here. What does it mean, a Bar Shich and Mars type of rain? It's going to pour, but it's not going to help the trees. It's not going to help the vegetation. It's going to go into the cisterns, great, but it's not going to do. It's actually in as we know, it's not. It's only if you have these like prepared cisterns. But sometimes if you have, it doesn't able to penetrate enough. If it comes down too fast, either it could. But they call runoff. Okay, we're not getting into that now. But nothing more. Before it's Pesach, the Gemara says we cry out for rain that didn't happen for the trees, even by around Pesach time. If it didn't have enough rain to fill up the cistern, so we're not going to have enough to drink. Even by Sukkot, we're going to cry out, right? Even before, right? We're not going to be thinking about Macheshbon when the regalim, like none of that. If it is no rain enough in the cisterns, we're going to be crying out by Sukkot time. We need to have rain in order to be able to drink. This is not a situation of drought in terms of food. We're just going to die of thirst. And for sure, if there's simply not enough rain just to even drink, meaning forget the cisterns in the future. If there's not enough to drink it, of course we have to cry out right away. So the more wants to know, what does it mean? What does it mean when crying out right away? So on Monday, Thursday, Monday, again, the series that we have already discussed. So then they will cry out right away. And when these situations we just mentioned is in their own districts, we're not talking here about situations of the wider country. We're talking about in their districts. There was no rain. If there are people having thirst, etc. I should mention that the Rashi yesterday we talked about. Rashi says that you can literally be crying out in Aspamia and in Bavel for the tzara. Why? Because the tzara mehalechas, the tzara that's going from place to place. But if you look in the Rambam, when the Rambam brings down the halacha, he brings it down just in Eretz Yisrael. And for the Mishnah, if you remember, the Mishnah had a Ma'aser Sheyard Zikanim Yerushalayim, the Zikanim from Yerushalayim, so that there was the Shidafan and Ashkelon, and they made a whole fast in Eretz Yisrael. And that it sort of makes sense because Ashkelon, Yerushalayim, it's all sort of one country. It's not too far away from one another. But to say in Spain and in Eretz Yisrael is going to be the same weather pattern, it's a Makam Alechas, seems a little bit of a stretch. So Rashi seems to suggest that, but the Rambam, I think, is disagreeing. So over here, what we're saying is, when we're talking about here, it's just in a certain area that is lacking water, so they're going to cry for themselves. But we're not considering this in Makam Alechas if the towns nearby, etc., or other areas in that country are not suffering it. Then obviously they're not going to be crying out. Again, we would have to modulate. When is it going to be considered Makam Alechas and when not, right? Because we said yesterday that in a situation where it rained in one city and the next city it didn't rain, then it could be that the cities around it also have to do it, right? It was Machlekes, Rabbi Kiva, the Tanakama, if they're Masrian or Masana, whatever, but that's not the point. So what do you mean over here now that we're only saying that and only in that specific district they have to do it, but not in the other districts? Again, it must be, we have to moderate exactly where we're talking about. It must be further out, not so close in terms of vicinity-wise. Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense. It would be a contradiction for that. Fine, so Zot the Gemara. No, where are we up to? No, Askra. Askra is a type of a disease. The Gemara Brachos, remember we talked about the Misa, right, of Askra is like diphtheria, I think we said. So Askra was Manchesh by Misa Masrina. If people are dying from the Askra, right, it's a very bad type of death. So then you're going to be fasting and crying out for that as well. If it's not the situation, Masrina like a boy, right? The types of grasshoppers that can come down, b'chol, even a small amount of these grasshoppers. Another type of grasshopper, you're also going to cry out for. Right? You were going to cry out on the trees on all 6 years of the Shemitah cycle, except for Shvias. You're right. If there's not enough rain for the trees, but if there's not enough rain in the cisterns, you can even cry on Shvias. 1 second. Of course, you have to cry out for rain, even on Shemitah, even if you're not allowed to grow stuff. Why? Because the Aniyim need stuff to eat. You already brought stuff in, but what about the Aniyim? So, of course, you have to cry even in Shvius. So there's an interesting question. Does this halachas about crying, kindness for Geshamim, does it apply on Shemitah or not? So, Yamachlis, Tanakam says, no, you're not planting. There's such a who needs it? The Aniyim need it. Another bride says that you do cry out for the Ilanis on the 6 years, but not on Shemitah. But on the Bershich Lamaris, even on Shvius. Again, the same thing. After Ilanis, you even cry on the Ilanis during Shemitah. Masrian, and he goes even further. Even on Sfachim, which is the growths that happen naturally, you cry even for that on Shvius because the Aniyim need it. Fine. I think we're going to have to stop over here. All right.